Hello and welcome to #Africa. I'm Marcel Gordon. Let's take a look at the stories making headlines on the continent. Algeria President Abdelaziz Bouteflika has announced he won't seek a fifth term in office. It comes after weeks of protests against his plan for re-election. Bouteflika also postponed polls scheduled for April 18. In response, thousands of Algerians held rallies in cities across the country to denounce what they viewed as an attempt by government to cling to power. The 82-year-old leader returned to the country after undergoing medical treatment in Switzerland. And Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir has reshuffled his cabinet, appointing at least 15 new ministers. The move comes amid relenting protests calling for the president to quit. Concerned protests insist Bashir must leave office and a transition team be appointed. And President Cyril Ramaphosa has commended Zimbabwe's new administration on its efforts to get out of its current economic difficulties. Speaking at the third session of the South Africa-Zimbabwe Bi-National Commission, Ramaphosa says South Africa stands ready to render support to its neighbour. To discuss this, we're joined by Africa analyst Gideon Chitanga. Gideon, thank you so much for joining us. All eyes were on this visit by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and some of his comments raised some eyebrows because it comes just soon after the Human Rights Watch issued a report urging the President of South Africa and other Southern African leaders to push Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa to put an end to security force abuses. Were you surprised by the tone that President Ramaphosa took this week?
No, not really. I'm not surprised. I think that if we read what has persistently come from the corridors of power in South Africa, the focus of their policy in Zimbabwe is to ensure stability, but they are mostly concerned with economic reforms and efforts to revive the economy of Zimbabwe, and not necessarily the politics. So the politics becomes a factor only to the extent that it destabilizes what they see as a progressive economic thrust post the Mugabe government. So President Ramaphosa's comments are in line with what South Africa is trying to do, assist Zimbabwe as much as possible, if not with an economic package, then morally to make sure that they assist to lobby and draw the attention to what they see as the major issue, which is the economic concerns more than the politics.
And now we've had unending reports of human rights abuses in the country, some confirmed, some unconfirmed. How do you think President Cyril Ramaphosa's comments and his tone this week in Zimbabwe would be greeted in certain quarters in Zimbabwe?
Look, historically, I think in post-President Mandela, the policies of the South African government have been consistent in terms of avoiding public criticism towards the government of Zimbabwe, mainly during the era of Mugabe, but we see the same pattern. So it is fair to say South Africa has a consistent policy towards many African countries where they choose to engage quietly to deal with the sensitive matters behind public corridors. In part of my research, I call this Pan-African conflict diplomacy, where you don't quarrel or create or sort of inflame a situation which is already volatile by engaging in a public discourse of criticizing each other, but sort of cajoling or cancelling each other to say, look, you are going to extremes, and we certainly would want to back you where we think we can, but also try to manage your situation. This kind of focus is rooted on the idea that democracy is something that you don't achieve in an instant, and that the understanding that African countries are gradually evolving, and in doing so they are shaping their own systems of democracy based on a strong idea of sovereignty, which was achieved through some years of liberation struggles and so on. So I take that these values are really taking concrete shape within broad African countries, but also South Africa has come to respect this idea that you just don't openly intervene and exert pressure in such a way that is adversarial, because when you do that, you close channels of communication. So President Ramaphosa, who up to this point has not shown to be a foreign policy president, but to be taking a technocratic approach in terms of reviving the South African economy, is stuck to the tradition, or what is emerging as a tradition of South Africa's diplomacy and foreign policy in terms of engaging with African countries, and specifically Zimbabwe. Let's talk behind doors, let's cancel each other, and clearly the main interest is to make sure that Zimbabwe is politically stable and it can economically reboot its economy.
Some would argue, however, that approach has not been the most successful. If you take it back to under President Thabo Mbeki, who had the quiet diplomacy approach that many criticized him for, which I think is similar to the approach that you're speaking of. And yet, in Zimbabwe, and as much as they've now been able to elect a new president, their economic situation has just gone from bad to worse. What would your answer be to criticism that that kind of approach has not worked?
I understand the criticism and the frustration, but I think that it's also important to look at the history of these countries. One would ask, what else could South Africa do to Zimbabwe if it closes the channels of communication and if it proved to be very adversarial? Look, there is a real perception in a lot of African countries, and in Zimbabwe, in terms of mistrusting, or a perception that they have other views around the interests of South Africa, which are not necessarily what we hear in the public. So I am sure that South Africa is very alive to the historical sensitivities in terms of the evolution of its democracy and the diversity of interests that are alleged to be very influential actors within its policy drive. So that also influences what South Africa is capable of doing and not doing. I don't believe that at any moment it would have been right for South Africa, for example, to exert economic sanctions. We are already in a debate where a lot of observers are saying even the sanctions that were exerted by the West only helped to quicken the destruction of the socio-economic fabric and worsen political polarization in Zimbabwe. And at the present moment, what the country needs is comprehensive support to emerge out of its economic crisis. I think that President Mbeki has been a great visionary in terms of evolving a policy that could work as a framework to approach a lot of other conflicts in Africa. What do you do if you go out there and openly criticize and sanction? Do you have any other alternative? I don't see that if I were to compare with the West has any other option other than to reverse sanction and to find a way of engaging the Zimbabwean government and assist with economic development and growth. And by the way, one of the major problems in Zimbabwe today is that sanctions have displaced the middle class, the educated elites, which class should be a key sector in driving a democratic agenda. So you have a country which is mainly rural, and the rural population tend to be so partisanly behind the ruling party. And I don't think that they offer an adequate engine to drive change under the circumstances. I see change as a gradual process which would have to be driven by a middle class that should emerge out of a functional economy. And the best option is to engage the government, assist it with economic development, urge the government to be lesser and lesser repressive, and allow open debate, which does not only open space for politics, but also open space for economic initiative and ending corruption, and allowing people to hold the government broadly accountable on a range of issues, not only politics and human rights.
We're going to have to leave it there for now. Africa analyst Gideon Chitanga, thank you so much for your insight on developments in Zimbabwe and indeed its relationship with South Africa. Thank you so much for your time this week. Now, when we return, floods in southern Africa leave thousands displaced. More on that in just a moment. Stay with #Africa.